So good morning, and thank you all for joining us today for our UNC Injury Prevention Research Center Connect, Empower, Prevent Injury and Violence Prevention webinar series. My name is Ciara Scott, and I'm a project manager at the center, and I will be moderating today's presentation. So just to give you a little background about this series, our center puts on this series essentially to provide a platform for researchers and practitioners working in the injury and violence prevention space to be able to have a place to share their innovative and impactful research, initiatives, techniques, strategies, all to help generate discussion and foster connection that will inform and empower injury and violence prevention research and initiatives. And so this is one of several educational events hosted by the Injury Center. And these webinars are hosted on the second Wednesday of each month from 12 to 12:30 p.m. And every month we feature a different speaker that is going to present on research or initiatives related to an injury and violence prevention topic area. And so this series, we're currently in the second round, and it will be going until May of 2024. So each month at the same time on the second Wednesday, you can find us here with a new presentation. And on the screen, you can find a URL that will take you directly to our webinar page on our website where you can find more information about our schedule. So before we get things started today, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. One thing I wanted to let you all know is that we are going to have time for question and answers today during the presentation. So that'll happen immediately following the presentation from today's speaker. And throughout the presentation, you can feel free to be dropping questions as they come to mind into the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat, collecting questions, and I'll pass those to the speaker once we get to that Q&A section. And this presentation is being recorded, and it's going to be made available on our UNC IPRC YouTube page. And those are typically available a couple of weeks after the webinar. And with that in mind, in order to protect the quality of our recording, we have disabled video and mic for the audience. So you won't be able to turn on your video or unmute currently. But when we get to the Q&A, I will give you the ability to unmute so that you can engage in discussion with the speaker. So now I'm going to pass things over to Dr. Steve Marshall, who is our director at the Injury Prevention Research Center, to just say a few words and introduce you to the speaker.
Thanks a lot, Ciara. It's a real pleasure to welcome Dr. McClure to the IPRC series of presentations. UNC IPRC, as I think most people know, is a CDC-supported injury control research center, and we're committed to conducting research in our area of expertise. You see the focus areas in front of you, and then supporting people in their training aspirations, and also integrating the products of research with the views of the practice community. So, as I said, Dr. McClure, or Libby, her work has focused on the ways in which historical and structural inequalities reinforce, perpetuate, and continue health disparities down through time and across generations. She earned her PhD in an outstanding program, the program of epidemiology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, of course, I'm biased as a graduate of the program myself. And she had a concentration in social and occupational epidemiology, and it was a pleasure to work with Dr. McClure on her dissertation on job segregation, health disparities at aluminum smelting facility in North Carolina. And that was an exemplary piece of research because it incorporated not just environmental justice perspectives, but the actual views of the people who worked in the smelter. And it's very compelling, I think, to see their narratives about being exposed to environmental contaminations right next to the epidemiologic data. So I'll hand it over to Libby without further ado. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for the intro, Steve, and for coordinating, Ciara. Today I'll be talking about some work with the Occupational Injury group. And this work is currently in press with a journal, so it's not quite publicly available, but certainly welcome folks' thoughts, particularly about the policy implications of it. So it's called 40 Years of Struggle in North Carolina, Workplace Segregation and Fatal Occupational Injury Rates. And I'll give a little bit of background about me and sort of in the form of a positionality statement, and then some background and methods for this research project, as well as results and conclusions. So my research areas are sort of at the intersection of environmental justice, occupational epidemiology, and applied public health. And the environmental justice movement aims to address environmental racism, which is defined by Bob Bullard as any policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages individuals, groups, or communities based on race. And so as a white, cisgender, able-bodied researcher myself, I seek out collaborative research that centers the concerns and questions of historically marginalized populations. So like Steve mentioned, I'm an occupational epidemiologist with experience conducting community-engaged research projects, as well as large-scale records-based disease and mortality studies. And I use collaborative methodologies to engage with communities who are facing occupational and environmental hazards and challenging oppression in their daily lives. And broadly, my work is focused on the ways in which historical and structural inequalities create health disparities. And my research is justice-focused and community-driven, and it aims to both critically complicate traditional study of health and also support social change. So drawing on Sandra Harding's distinction between methods and methodologies, where methods are the tools we use to gather and analyze, while methodologies are a sort of larger school of thought or theories that guide the questions we ask and how we conduct research. So the values and methodologies that guide my approach to research are shown here. Critical race theory, public health praxis, which has 4 foci. Those are contemporary racism, acknowledging biases in knowledge production, operationalizing racism as a variable worthy of quantification, and conducting research toward action. Anti-racism, decolonization methodologies involving critical evaluation of the way we approach our research methods, centering the most impacted such that those harmed lead in defining the solutions, and intervention generative. And so for this project, the question was inspired by a number of factors happening in North Carolina right now. So North Carolina's workforce has a legacy of racial and ethnic segregation and persistent disparities in fatal occupational injuries, with Black men historically experiencing the highest rates. But also over the past 20 years, the Hispanic workforce in North Carolina has grown, and rates of occupational fatality have increased among Hispanic men. And this has been getting a lot of advocacy and news attention at the rise in both rates of fatal injury in the workplace, as well as disparities by race and gender in those fatalities. So we were interested in thinking about how much the disparity in workplace fatalities could be reduced if all workers experienced the occupational conditions of white workers. So we identified cases of occupational fatality from the North Carolina Office of the Chief Medical Examiner and the North Carolina State Center for Health Statistics death certificates data. And we estimated rates of fatal injury within industry, race, age, and sex groups. And we calculated the expected numbers of fatalities among Black and Hispanic workers had they experienced the rates of white male workers. And then also estimated person years of life lost using the North Carolina life expectancy estimates. So the workforce between 1999 and 2017, which is the dates of our cohort, is predominantly male, particularly for the Hispanic workers. It's about 50% male among Black workers and closer to 60 among white workers. And then broken down by industry, you can see sort of the ways in which different ethnic and racial groups are segregated. Hispanic workers contributed 32% of their worker years and experienced 58% of their fatalities in the construction industry. And overall, there's a pretty wide disparity in the mortality rates, with the standardized rate ratio between Hispanic and white workers being 2.11, so about twice the rate of more fatal occupational injury among Hispanic workers compared to white workers. And the fatal injury rate among Black workers was also elevated above that of white workers. But when we broke it down by age group, you can really see where the largest disparity arises. And that's in the 35 to 54 age group, where the rate of fatal occupational injury is nearly, is like 3.5 times that of white workers among Hispanic workers and 1.4 times that of white workers among Black workers. And then in terms of person years of life lost, we see the greatest number of person years of life lost being experienced by the Hispanic workforce as they're dying at younger ages, particularly in these industries that have the high rates of fatal occupational injury. So those include agriculture, agricultural services, construction, forestry and logging, and then transportation. And again, we see the highest person years of life lost in construction and also the forestry and logging industries. So overall, the main study findings were that North Carolina has had major demographic changes in the workforce, and that's impacted the role of segregation in those industries and jobs. And we found that if Black and Hispanic workers had experienced the workplace safety of white workers, that disparities in occupational fatal injury rates would be substantially reduced. And then we're really trying to elevate this concept of thinking of workforce segregation as a structural, an element of structural racism, which must be addressed to eliminate health disparities. And so with that, I'd love to acknowledge my collaborators on this project: Amelia Martin, Shabra Ranapawala, Mary Alice Nocera, John Cantrell, Stephen Marshall, and David Richardson, and our collaborators and funders of the work. And with that, I will open it up for questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Libby. So now we can take questions from the audience. So I don't see any questions in the chat, but we'll give you a moment. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. And then I'm also going to enable the your mic so you can unmute. But if you would like to ask a question out loud, if you could just use the raise hand reaction, just so we don't have multiple people unmuting at once.
Well, it's not like this group to be quiet.
Okay, we have a question from Mike Bliss. Mike, you can go ahead and unmute.
Hi, Libby. Hi. I have a question about mechanism of injury. I'm reminded from work with the violent death reporting system and Suitors, our overdose detail death system, that some of these same occupations also show up in those more specific kind of mechanism specific I guess I'd call it mechanism and intent specific data sets. I'm wondering if that came up at all in your work here, and saying, you know, like among this group, you know, that there's suicide here as a cause, there's pain related injuries, you know, so how did I guess mechanism, not quite the right word, but how did some of the details pop up, if at all?
Yeah, definitely. We did sort of a deep dive into the main industries where the occupational injuries were occurring, and I'm just pulling up that table now. So in construction, the most common means of death was falls. And then we also saw a fair number of motor vehicle and machinery accidents, and then a pretty decent number of heat-related fatalities, which is another piece we've been starting to think about in the research group too. And then in agriculture and agricultural services, a lot of machinery and motor vehicle accidents, and then heat fatalities. So yeah, so thinking about sort of what kinds of protections should be in place for those workers is really, yeah, where we've been thinking about that. I know the heat piece, David Richardson was approached by somebody with OSHA that they're wanting to update the analysis of heat-related fatalities that he did in like 2000 in hopes of enforcing some stricter regulations and protections for workers who are outside in the summertime, like, yeah, so in construction and agriculture in particular. But yeah, there's another person in the group, Chelsea Martin, who's been doing work on suicides within this data set. And I think she's getting close to publishing that piece, but there weren't a high number of suicides and homicides in those industries that we were focusing on with regard to racial and ethnic disparities. So it'd be interesting to hear what y'all find too.
We've got another question in the chat. Sharon Brown wants to know, what policy changes would you recommend to improve the workplace safety measures for non-white populations?
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. So that's actually something I've been trying to dive into with this revise and resubmit we're working on. And it's, I tend to focus on the sort of community level and local protections that can be used. There's a lot of, in terms of the Hispanic workforce, there's a fair number of undocumented workers and migrant farm workers in the agricultural industries. And there's really not a lot of state or federal level protections available to them. And so thinking about the sort of informal structures that help keep each other safe. But on the sort of state and national level policies, certainly thinking about protections and requirements related to heat, related to protective equipment and engineering controls, because we see a lot of machinery and motor vehicle accidents being the cause of death. So, and then North Carolina is tough because it's traditionally, from the like public health and Department of Labor side, a pretty industry friendly state. And so thinking about ways we can give a little more regulatory power to the state health department to inspect and protect workers in these more dangerous settings. But also, I'm curious if there are folks on the call who have more policy expertise, because I think as epidemiologists, we're often sort of discouraged from doing deeper policy analyses in our publications. And so if folks have thoughts and ideas, I'd love to hear from you.
It looks like we have another question from Kristen. She has her hand raised, so Kristen, you can unmute and ask your question.
Thanks, Yara. Thanks, Libby. That was a great presentation. I really liked how you presented the data and had everything, illustrated so well. And I was curious, just building on what you were just talking about in terms of policy, and have you considered like what partners or what people you might share your findings with, and sort of, I guess, dive into that next step in terms of, like, if you were to think about policy, like who would be, the people I could present this to or share this with, or whatever. I mean, I have one of my colleagues years ago in the poultry industry. I know she kind of tried to do that with various groups, and I think your assessment on the Department of Labor in North Carolina is fairly accurate then, and seems to be the case now. But just really curious on your ideas.
Yeah, and I would certainly welcome any advice you have from that experience and your friend's experience. But we've mostly talked to some of the sort of local community level worker advocacy groups, and thinking about different like bilingual worker protections that can be instituted. I think it would be interesting to have some conversations with the State Department of Public Health, as I know they're trying to up their regulatory power in terms of what can be done with knowing that the Department of Labor sort of has the final say on what's allowed to happen. And then thinking about too, like, national level, with the heat related deaths I mentioned, some sort of national regulations that would be helpful. But yeah, I think sort of making it available to those sort of higher level policy groups would be ideal. But yeah, I'm open to ideas for sure.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. We've got some work that really, actually, Steve Marshall sort of got our group. It's catastrophic sport injuries, but maybe there's, if you ever want to chat, there's ways we can discuss. But thank you so much. Your work is really interesting.
Thank you.
We've got a couple of comments in the chat from Mike, and one in response to this last point. So I'll say that one first. He mentioned that he thinks this could be a DPH IVP presentation with Scott and the rest of the branch, and perhaps during a lunch and learn that they have often. So maybe y'all can connect on that.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thanks.
And then his other questions, following up on the previous question you answered, he said that he's also wondering about the line between occupational deaths, like on the job type, and then occupation specific disparities in all or other cause mortalities off the job within your cohort from this research.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a tough one. And I think Mary Alice is on the call, so hopefully she can correct me if I get anything wrong. But the medical examiner determines deaths on the job based on an injury that occurs on the job. And I think if they pass away within 24 hours, they're included in the cohort. And there's some adjudication around whether they're deemed natural causes of death. This is something that showed up in the heat-related fatalities as well, is that if they're coded as natural, then they don't get flagged to be picked up in our cohort. I see a new message just came in. 30 days of injury. Okay, so that's a lot longer than I realized. Yeah, thanks, Mary Alice. But so certainly, I think there are injuries and issues that could be related to the job that we're missing in our cohort. And you'll notice that we only went through 2017 because with COVID, we didn't have access to the data offices. And I think it's going to be a whole other set of analytical and conceptual tools to be thinking about the way COVID interacts with this kind of cohort.
Thanks for putting that information in the chat, Mary Alice. So Mike actually had another question, if you don't mind sharing. He said that he was curious to hear a little bit about your Kendall Fellowship project on nuclear weapons and disparities.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's so I started at the end of August with the Union of Concerned Scientists in the Global Security Program. And we are working with a group of downwinders of the Hanford nuclear facility, which is in Eastern Washington State. And basically, it's a sort of big pivot for me because I'm new to nukes in general, but they're interested in bringing in more community engaged research methods and more epidemiologic perspective to their work, which has been traditionally mostly policy analysis around nuclear abolition. And so working with downwinders as well as some of the tribal nations impacted by the Hanford nuclear facility to document health harms. There's been a lot of work around nuclear uranium mining and facilities workers and their exposures and health outcomes, but very little resources for the surrounding communities and families of workers. So we're just trying to get started in a way that of like just compiling all the information that exists and doing some scoping work on what kinds of health studies could be useful for downwind communities.
All right. I want to do one last call for questions. We do have time if there's maybe one more, but if not, we can wrap things up. Okay. Well, thank you so much again, Libby, for your presentation. And for those who are interested in getting in contact with Libby, I know she had her contact information on the screen, and I'll also be sending a follow-up email, and I'll include her contact information as well for those who would like to connect. And so just really quickly before we end today, I want to forecast our next webinar coming up next month on December 13th, which will feature a presentation from Megan Luke and Ann Geisinger, who will be sharing about the work they've been doing with the North Carolina Comprehensive Suicide Prevention Program. And so registration is going to be opening soon for that, and I will include you all on that blast that goes out with that registration link. And then on the screen, there's a QR code. If you are willing to take our evaluation survey, we would really appreciate it just to give us some feedback to help inform future webinars. But otherwise, that is all that we have for you all today. So thank you so much for joining us, and have a good rest of your week.
Bye.
Thanks, Libby.
Thanks all.